Okay, our final panel of the day is on the topic that is synonymous with New Orleans, and that is music. Bruce Boyd Raeburn is the Director Emeritus of the Special Collections and former curator of the Hogan Jazz Archives at Tulane University. He holds a doctorate in history from Tulane and is the author of The New Orleans Style and the Writing of American Jazz History, as well as numerous scholarly articles on New Orleans jazz and historiography. He has also performed as a professional drummer for the past 47 years. Nick Spitzer is a producer of American Routes on WWNO, a folklorist, and a professor of anthropology and American studies at Tulane. His PhD dissertation centers on Zydeco and Afro-French Louisiana culture. He has been a cultural commentator and producer on NPR's All Things Considered, CBS's Sunday Morning, and NBC's Nightline. Spitzer was awarded the New Orleans Mayor Lifetime Achievement and Arts Award in 2006 and was named Louisiana Humanist of the Year for cultural recovery efforts after Hurricane Katrina. Finally, my colleague, Dr. Michael White, is an expert in his field of traditional New Orleans jazz. Dr. White is a commissioner of the New Orleans Jazz National Historic Park and a seasoned performer at Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center with his original Liberty Jazz Band. Amongst his numerous awards and recognition, Dr. White received the rank of Chevalier of Arts and Letters by the French government in 1987, and a National Heritage Fellowship Award by the National Endowment of Arts in 2008. By day, he is a professor of Spanish and African American music here at Xavier. And I want to let you guys know also that Dr. White will have a performance next Sunday at 2 o'clock in this very room, and the performance is titled Sacred and Sinful, Hymns and Blues in New Orleans Jazz. It will feature his band, the original Liberty Jazz Band, as well as special guests. So please help me and welcome March 18th. I did say next Sunday, right? Yeah, March 18th. Okay, please, please, please help me in welcoming this amazing panels. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and on behalf of the entire panel, I want to thank Priscilla and Sybil and Emily and the program committee for the symposium, for inviting us here and giving us an opportunity to talk about New Orleans music, which is certainly one of our favorite things to talk about. Jazz origins in New Orleans may be a little misleading because I'm really going to be talking about migration, but I wanted to riff a little bit on the theme of the symposium, which is home, and relate it to a concept common among diverse New Orleans jazz musicians from the early period, the idea of heart as a signifier of authenticity and performance, and then correlate that with migration, starting with this band. This is the Armand Piron Orchestra. The gentleman sitting at one side is Armand Piron. He's a Creole of color from the 7th Ward. He and Clarence Williams combined to form the first black-owned music publishing company on Tulane Avenue in 1915. And in 1919, they were doing so well, they decided to open a branch in Chicago. Both Piron and Clarence Williams went up there. Piron came back and formed a superlative band, which you see here. Clarence Williams stayed in spite of the race riot of 1919, came very close to taking a bullet. And then in the early 1920s, he split his time between New York and Chicago, promoting the repertoire that he and Armand Piron were either producing or buying, such as I Wish I Could Shimmy Like My Sister Kate, which they picked up from Louis Armstrong for $5 and did very well with that investment. The musicians we see here, this would be under segregation, defined as a black band, but is in fact multicultural, multi-ethnic. Among the players there would be Louis Old Man Cottrell, the drummer. He's an Afro-French Creole. He went prematurely gray, so they called him Old Man. Steve Lewis, the pianist, was an African-American. Two brothers from Algiers played in this band, Peter Bocage, the cornetist, and his younger brother Charlie, who was a banjo player and a vocalist. But Lorenzo Tio Jr., you see in the center, he is a Latino Creole, and to his right is Bobby Segura, who came from British Honduras, which later became Belize. So after Piron forms this band, and they perform at places like Spanish Fort, or a resort on Lake Pontchartrain in 1923, they're doing so well that they're invited up to New York City in the fall of 1923, and they begin recording for the Victor Talking Machine Company, making lots of interesting records that have a huge impact on New Orleans musicians. Even though this is classified as a society band, they really were a jazz band. They could play the blues. In the oral histories with members of the band, they talk about playing San Jacinto Hall in Treme, and they would play quadrille and schottische until the old folks went home at midnight, and then they start playing the blues, and that's when the fighting started. So they go up to New York in 1923, and they're recording, and they're doing so well up there that in January of 1924, they get a regular gig at Roseland Ballroom, and then they're up for an audition to the hottest show on Broadway, which is George White's Scandals of 1924. George White, the producer, had decided to take on Flo Ziegfeld, and so this show was beginning to eclipse Ziegfeld's Folly, and Piron was invited to audition. There's only one problem. During the audition, the members of the band played badly on purpose. They scuttled the audition. The reason being, they could not stand the idea of another winter in New York City. And so I haven't even mentioned the unavailability of gumbo and red beans and crawfish and all the other things they were used to. The cold wasn't the only explanation. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what was it that attracted them? What was that homing instinct that brought them back to New Orleans? Well, this is Spanish Fort, which is obviously a wonderful resort, sort of like a New Orleans version of Coney Island. And where they were playing was Tranchina, so it's a wonderful restaurant. And so the whole idea, and this is the kind of audience they're playing for. In 1923, this is the opening of the Pythian Roof Garden. And I used to use this image for my students and ask them to write stories about the conversations that were going on. But you can see the band. It's the Imperial Band led by Manuel Perez up on the gallery there. And so it's that thriving warmth of jazz performance that's so important and becomes a kind of a magnetic pull that brings New Orleans musicians back. It's not that New York is impossible, because we know Wynton Marsalis is quite happy in New York City. But in the case of the Piron Orchestra, they broke their band leader's heart because he had high aspirations, but the rest of the band thought it was much more important to be living the lifestyle that was compatible for them rather than buying extra coats for winters in New York City. The second idea I want to get into is this marker of authenticity, which is the idea that jazz musicians play from the heart. And what that really means is that it's not the notes you play, it's the emotional content of your playing, it's how you relate to the people in your audience that we just saw, how you connect to them on a human level, on a visceral level, through playing improvised jazz music. And so here's Bunk Johnson, and he's quoted in the literature as saying that. And someone he claimed to mentor, we're not too sure about it, but Louis Armstrong, certainly the most famous of all jazz musicians, and he makes the exact same statement. It's almost verbatim. Jazz is played from the heart. And lo and behold, Nick LaRocca, with the original Dixieland Jazz Band, the band that made the first jazz recording, made exactly the same statement. Jazz is played from the heart. This is probably the only common element between Louis Armstrong and Nick LaRocca, because LaRocca was a Sicilian-American who grew up in the Irish Channel on Magazine Street and became notorious as a white supremacist and the person who denied any credit to black vernacular music in New Orleans in terms of jazz origins. As you can see, creators of jazz is how they're promoting themselves. Even the rest of the band didn't buy into that, and certainly historians haven't. Well, how do these cultures get built? And the geographical proximity of New Orleans, its situation really is part of the explanation. You can see two waves of transatlantic culture coming over the 18th and early 19th century, and they really never stopped. And one obviously is Eurocentric, high culture and low culture, the other Afrocentric, the more important of the two, obviously. And the distinctions there are between the different kinds of musical practices we would associate with West Africa, the way Senegambians played music and the way Kikongo people played music, and those respective river systems were quite different, but they merged in New Orleans in places like Congo Square, but not only there. And also, we've heard a lot about Saint-Domingue and Cuba, and also let's include Central America as well, and the idea of hybridity and racial ethnic fluidity, mestizaje, that comes into New Orleans from the south, as well as clave rhythms and dotted eighth note syncopation with habanera. And then over the course of the 19th century, virtually all the culture that is produced in the Mississippi River Valley, which includes work songs on the river, ultimately blues, spirituals, alligator horse ballads, that's all coming down the river, and obviously that's a one-way street that leads to New Orleans. Congo Square obviously puts a defining characteristic on New Orleans culture in general because it's so exceptional. African dance and music was, shall we say, tolerated here, and maybe that's the same as promoted and curated by governments in New Orleans. And certainly Freddie Williams Evans has shown us that this is an incubator for pretty much any kind of New Orleans music that we want to talk about. French Opera House is the sort of iconic Eurocentric. Jazz musicians that went to the conservatory there, such as Arnold Loyacano, however, called that conservatory the Milano Conservatory because all the teachers were Italians, mostly Northern Italians. So in New Orleans, you scratch some French culture, you might find a surprise underneath. The key element in the jazz musicians is where they came from, and this is still the case in New Orleans, that you identify as an Orleanian, but it's really your neighborhood that is your primary affiliation. And when we look at where the jazz musicians came from, they came from the Lower French Quarter, from Tremé, from the 7th Ward, from Algiers. These are Creolized or African-American cultural footprints, which include Sicilians, which include Jews, and many other ethnicities, Latinos certainly. And uptown, in other words, to the left of Canal Street, we see Central City and the Irish Channel, also crazy quilt demographic situations. Central City, for example, had some interesting juxtapositions of people like Larry Shields, the clarinetist with the original Dixieland Jazz Band. He's Irish and Hungarian, and he lived off of LaSalle and First Street, and his next door neighbor was Buddy Bolden, the African-American cornet player, who was a little older, and so I like to think he was an influence on Shields, although Shields was also a captive of segregation like so much of the white population in the United States at the time. Funky Bud Hall is where Buddy Bolden played, and we can see just by the structure of the building that it wasn't always a dance hall on Sunday mornings, it was a church. And so this is an interesting sort of multiple land use in New Orleans, but any advantage for a party in New Orleans, you're definitely going to take advantage of that. Louisiana Phonograph Company, many people are surprised to know that this was an early site of jazz recording, and you have George Paoletti, who is one of those Northern Italians who makes cylinders of popular dance music, but also played in the French opera. But the really interesting guy is Louis Bébé Vasnier, who grew up in the 7th Ward. He was a Creole minstrel musician, and he made comedy records called The Brother Rasmus Sermon. Later on, Louis Armstrong does the Elder Eatmore Sermons in 1938 as an homage to Burt Williams, but they were doing it in New Orleans before Burt Williams got around to it. And he also does these banjo accompaniments. Turkey in the Straw, for example, is quoted in Jelly Roll Morton's first composition, the Jelly Roll Blues, published in Chicago in 1915. That's Paoletti on Royal Street. You can tell by the way he's attired that he's not a jazz musician. But he taught jazz musicians. At Warren Easton, he taught Louis Prima, Sterling Bowes, and Meyer Weinberg. So I'm going to advance a little bit, but youth culture in New Orleans, this was really the force that drove the development of jazz here. And this is an audience with Stalebread's band, and these are all blue-collar, good-time people, just letting off some steam. They work hard during the week. They want some jazz on the weekend. You can see from some of the things being poured up at the top, maybe that's some lemonade. The guy sitting at the bottom, definitely not lemonade. Okay, I want to take two examples of how the homing instinct and playing from the heart intersect in the lives of New Orleans jazz musicians in these migration narratives. Louis Armstrong is shown with his entire family in this picture, which is his mother, Mayanne, and his second mother, actually his sister, Mama Lucy. And one of the things I wanted to emphasize, and this includes the impact of the Saint-Domingue diaspora, is that New Orleans, particularly in the black community, was a matrifocal network that many women raised male jazz musicians to the trade. They also became jazz musicians despite the obstacles against them. If you wanted to be something other than a vocalist or a piano player in the 1920s, there were major obstacles to achieving that, eventually overcome, as Sherry Tucker's work shows very effectively. Louis Armstrong, his idea of home, various locations are involved. He lived back of town, but he also spent some significant time at the Colored Waifs Home, working with Peter Davis, who set his compass and made him realize that if he worked hard enough, he could be a musician, like so many New Orleans musicians start out. But his real mentor was Joe Oliver, who brings him to Chicago in 1922. And then the question is, well, unlike the Piron Orchestra, Louis Armstrong took to the south side of Chicago and really sort of achieved self-recognition there. His musical identity, according to Tom Brothers, certainly was formed when he was playing with Erskine Tate's band at the Vendome Theater, and that had a huge impact on New Orleans music because this was the process that took it from collective improvisation to solo improvisation, and Louis Armstrong became the poster child for solo improvisation as well as collective improvisation and free vocals. What does it say, John? Okay, so, time it up. So to conclude, Louis Armstrong staying in Chicago. The red beans and rice that Stella Oliver cooked for him, probably the main reason. And I'll leave it at that and welcome Nick Spitzer up to the platform. Thanks for your attention.
Let's see what we got here. Okay. The sign said, "Exit stage." I used to work at Carnegie Hall. I tell you, when the union stagehand said that, you got out. But we're in New Orleans, so we'll hopefully be able to make all this work together. I come at this as an ethnographer. I believe history is something that we only deal with in the present, and so as a result, I'm always a little suspicious, but today I've become quite a believer in great history that I've been hearing. I'm not here, though, to talk about disciplines. I'm here to talk about intangible culture and my sense that New Orleans was built by music and more broadly performance and has been rebuilt by music and performance. And of course, the great moment for that in our recent memory is the period around Katrina and its aftermaths. And since he's working on that, let me see if I can work on this for a second here and make this work for everybody. Okay, I've got audio. What are we missing here, guys? It should be up. It was up. It is up. Wait a minute. Maybe there's one other up to get up with. There's the other up. Okay, let's take
What kind of belongings were you able to scrape together? What kind of belongings were you able to scrape?
Actually, it's out of Toussaint. It is. It's much better than my friend. I can test that. I use it as what I call their oral literacy. When I was talking about history, in New Orleans, Alan Toussaint's great hero was Professor Longhair. He would never call himself a piano professor. Tulane did give him an honorary, and he was very humble as usual about such things. But when you look at this image of him, you're seeing somebody who looks, well, he could be a professor, but of course his learning is in the neighborhood, listening to the radio, to records, to people in his family. And a lot of the people who called themselves piano professors over the years, whether it was Toots Washington, or we could go back to Jelly Roll, or we could go back to Gottschalk. These people were, in some cases, exposed to classical music, but in the case particularly of the people in the Afro-French and African-American line, they were exposed to the music of the neighborhood, which meant gospel music, and the blues, and rhythm and blues, and of course jazz. And as a result of that, you become a piano professor by acclaim of your ability. It's part of that notion of you can do it, you can be it. And that's a very powerful thing in New Orleans to this day, to be able to perform the self. So let's see New Orleans. We know it from the air, and we probably remember it, many of us, around this time. Let me tell you what Alan Toussaint had to say about his experience here at that time. This is an interview from 2005, September, just before the big first fundraiser in Madison Square Garden, Big Apple for the Big Easy.
What kind of belongings were you able to scrape together to get out of town with?
Hardly anything, because I was planning on going back the next morning, and that was it. So everything else was at the mercy of our arch enemy lady, Katrina. The bottom floor of my house had 7 or 8 feet of water. So everything in my room where I do my editing and writing and arranging and all of the musical things that I do, and it's all gone.
In that room, I assume, is at least one piano.
Oh yes, my Steinway is the most important thing there, and then everything that surrounds it, like synthesizers, recording equipment, and all of my records, and it's all gone. Yes, sorry to say, but spirit didn't drown.
That is the key line.
I think I care more about the city than my own personal material losses. I have thought about those things for a moment, but I immediately begin thinking how exciting it's going to be to rebuild, replace. And I'm so glad that I was in New Orleans to witness this great
Toussaint
event.
steps forward.
It brought an opportunity that we can take advantage of in such a wonderful way, and I'm eager to get started.
And becomes a cultural citizen. Assure you that as I went around the country at that time to very prestigious universities to talk about New Orleans and its recovery, urban planners, real estate specialists, even historic preservationists were having none of the idea that music and culture would help rebuild the city. Honestly, I think it's the only thing that allowed it to happen. Everything else was an instrumentality around it. And of course, the second line we hear about early on around November 1st, this is not that second line, this is one Uptown Pigeon Town Steppers with Rebirth, but we'll come back to them in a few minutes. I want to move on and show you Johnny St Cyr, who was in Armstrong's band and recorded with Armstrong in the 1920s. And given the time frame, I think I'll just keep moving here, but simple to say that Johnny St Cyr did not stay with the band. He came home to New Orleans, and what did he do the rest of his life for a profession? He was a plasterer. And as a plasterer, he worked to build and rebuild the city. He's also quoted, and his words are actually at the Hogan Jazz Archive, or the Jazz Archive, or what is now the Tulane Archive of Jazz. He talks about Jelly Roll, who he kind of makes fun of. He made fun of the professional musicians. He wanted to be a working person. The reason I found this so interesting is because the stereotype of New Orleans is always the joie de vivre side, laissez-le bon temps rouler side, particularly by the tourist afflicted and others around the country and around the world. But working people have been great musicians, and many of them are descended from the free people of color, whether they came from Domingue or were sui generis here. And so that crossover between work and play has always been extremely powerful here in the city. So here's Johnny St Cyr talking about jazz musicians when Lomax asked him about Jelly Roll. And he was somewhat diplomatic. He says a jazz musician has to be a working class of man, out in the open all the time, healthy and strong. That's what's wrong today. These new guys haven't got the force. They don't like to play all night. They don't think they can play unless they're loaded. But a working man have the power to play hot whiskey or no whiskey. You see, the average working man is very musical. Playing music for him is just relaxing. He gets as much kick out of playing as the other folks get out of dancing. So there is this counter-narrative, not to say that music isn't important, but to play music, you can be part of a particular community, and that community has a relationship to the world of work. Armstrong had him in his band, but he came back to New Orleans and did not continue in the band, and as you saw his business card uptown. There's Jelly Roll, who he spoke of, and everybody should read the Jelly Roll Morton autobiography with Lomax. It's one of the great works of New Orleans. I commend it to you. I commend it to my students. I call this gentleman the Jelly Roll Morton of plastering. This is the late Earl Barthé. Besides the similarity, he was also loquacious. And he told me that he loved to listen to opera while he worked, but also Muddy Waters. His sister was an opera singer, and he said that it was Carmen that had the plasterers beat. When we went to St. Louis Cathedral, he took me where there was a signature of 3 generations back in his family and the interior plaster work just at the beginning of the steeple. Musicians play in public. The building tradesmen have public visibility, but no signature available for most of the public to see. However, sometimes from the job, they bring home a little extra plaster and end up with a shotgun house with a gigantic Saturn ring-like medallion in the living room, what's called the Cadillac finish by people. Verdolio actually worked with Mr. Barthé and also participated in the Oddworth Brass Band. You see him with his drumsticks, his hat, and his business card, sheetrock plastering, and more. Here's Eddie Bow, and given the time frame, I'm going to play Eddie a little bit for you. He has since passed, as has Mr. Barthé, but I just wanted you to hear a little bit of our conversation about work and play.
Let's talk a little bit about your life in New Orleans. Over the years, not only have you played music, you've done so many things, and one of the things I know you've done is you've been a craftsman. Tell me a little about your background in construction and crafts.
Well, we as the Bocage had to learn to do the craftsman when he was 5. All the males had to learn how to start off and build, because they were all builders, and I think we also had shipbuilders, and we had construction engineers and in the family. So they taught us what might be of interest to us, and it might help us out as far as having another skill other than what you choose. Mm-hmm. If you choose something, if you tend to choose something else, you will always be able to fall back on that.
Mm-hmm. And what skills did you learn as a builder?
Well, Bricklaying and carpentry was basically what my dad did, so I had to learn to do it too.
Did you like that work when you did it? Or was
Yes, I love it as much as the music.
Really?
Yes, indeed. I love to stand back and look at what I've put together.
When was the last time you had a hammer in your hand or a trowel? I mean, has it been a while, or is it?
No, it's a couple of weeks ago. I was in Mississippi, and I had to rearrange some parts of the roof. But in this case, in the other case in New Orleans, a partial part of the roof blew off. So I got to reconstruct that after I find an adjuster, and we try to get something together. I'm gonna wear my face. I'm gonna be happy now in New Orleans, that place. When the sun began to shine and everybody get in that line, I wanna be in that number.
Whoop.
I wanna be in that number.
Finally, Mr. Phobos, who, like Jelly Roll, spoke of his ancestors in France, and here he is with Captain Handy's band, Louisiana Shakers in the 20s, the trumpet player, and let's see, we can advance him. Here he is in the WPA band. There was a black and white WPA band for many years until he passed away at age of 103. He was the last surviving member, and you can see him over there. I think it's the, let's see, maybe second. It's so small here. I think it's the second in from the right, third in from the right, holding trumpet. And then here he is with his uncles and brothers as a tinsmith. And he made many of the lampposts in the French Quarter and the Marigny. And he pointed out to me that many people knew him as a musician and others knew him as a tinsmith, but most people didn't realize that the two were related. Here they are as the Mighty Four dancing at the Melody Inn, one of the great recordings of an all-Creole band. And I'll just bring it to its logical conclusion. I don't have time for Tootie Montana, a building tradesman himself. Talk about the building and the suit. Or Irma Thomas, of course, who was another great cultural citizen of the recovery, for that matter, Fats. But I'll leave it at Fats, and I'll say this, and again, we're sort of out of time. 4 great songs about coming home to New Orleans. One is Going Back to New Orleans, that's how they pronounce it in the song, because it's Joe Liggins, who's from Oklahoma, out in South Central LA, but it was Ellis Walsh, a native New Orleanian, who wrote it. He also wrote Saturday Night Fish Fry. That's 1952. Get up to 1960, and you got Fats. Walking to New Orleans. You can all hear that one in your mind. I'd love to play it for you now, but I think you can imagine it. Written in part by Bobby Charles Guidry, a Cajun from Abbeville. And then, if we were to advance it further, I'd have to say, yes, we can. Toussaint, on the funky side, the thing he originally wrote for Lee Dorsey, backed by the Meters, made a hit by the Pointer Sisters, and it comes back out in his cultural citizen role, where he becomes the performer after Katrina, not just the producer and the songwriter, but gets out and plays. And finally, the one I really ought to play, and if at the very end we have time, we'll do it. Otherwise, you can look it up on Spotify or wherever else you want to go. And that would be No Place Like Home. That's Soul Rebels and Trombone Shorty. And in it, the lead singer says, I want to get married in St. Louis Cathedral. And it's all done in a hip-hop rap style. I have never heard a hip-hop tune with anyone saying they want to get married in a cathedral. But it's just illustrative of how powerful the sense of coming home, no place like home, is exemplified in these 4 different pieces of music around New Orleans. And all I can say is please tune into American Roots Sunday nights at 6 o'clock. Thank you. Do you need any of this? Good. You can do it with that.
Well, he asked me, did I need any of that? Well, I do have audio visuals in a sense. We might have the audio part if we have time a little later. And the visual part is that you all have to try to visualize what I'm saying. And it was interesting to hear Nick talking about the musicians with all these side professions. And I'm going to make a confession that I've never said before publicly. Somebody said, it's not that bad. And that is, you know, some people have accused me over the years of being a professor that plays a little music on the side. I have always been a musician that is a professor on the side, believe me. I have a very painful corn to prove it on my thumb where the clarinet rests. Today I'm going to talk about the New Orleans second line tradition, social and cultural implications. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to touch on some important points. Now, although I've studied and researched the New Orleans second line and parade traditions and jazz for many years, my most significant connection to this tradition started when I was a senior here at Xavier University, when I became a member of Doc Paulin's brass band. For several years, we played in annual parades for every social aid and pleasure club that existed. We did dozens of club members' funerals, and we also played for a lot of church parades. That was a beautiful tradition that is unfortunately now extinct. Since then, I don't play a lot of social club parades these days, every now and then, but I continue to play in a lot of jazz funerals, and I estimate that in the last several years I've played in over 150 jazz funerals. I was on the scene when the authentic traditional jazz style was the dominant music in black social aid and pleasure clubs. That's like talking about the mid-1970s. And I witnessed a radical evolution when new young musicians formed bands like the Dirty Dozen and later the Rebirth, which forever changed the look, the sound, the attitude, and the style of brass bands and community parades and funerals. The most striking thing about being in the middle of social club parades and jazz funerals in the mid-1970s was the feeling of being in a magical, almost spiritual dimension in which many normal daily concerns, rules, and things concerning social order were replaced in this large sea of African American power that seemed to function in a different time and space than the so-called real world. It's like a world recreated. Hundreds and sometimes thousands of people in various manners of dress, from very different backgrounds, social and economic and educational levels, seemed to all be equal somehow in these events, united and totally free as members of the collective celebration of social clubs, brass bands, and second liners. Older people and others sitting on their porches or standing in the doorway or leaning out the window were also a part of this euphoric celebration. You could just see and feel that the traditional jazz music was not just a danceable, fun music, but it was also a powerful expression of all of our lives, our hopes, our aspirations, our joys, our fears, everything, all of life's experiences. The parades and funerals brought a sense of bonding and unity, of common and shared understanding, of a common struggle. But far from being tragic or sad, the community parades were a bold demonstration of power and collective creativity. They made you feel good. And many times you get new friends that you might not normally have. Even today, I see some of the people that I met in second line parades, and we have a bond that ties us together. And normally I might not know, I see a guy, man, where you been? Oh, they had me in Angola for stealing the television. Now, you know that ain't no reason to put nobody in Angola for 6 months for stealing. And that's true. But we are like brothers, and you see people, families, children grow up, and there's a certain bond that the music brings community members together. While the freedom of expression and collective improvisation of jazz is often viewed as a living metaphor for or a model of democracy, nowhere is it more obvious than in the second-line parades, in which equal, free, improvised, creative, spontaneous celebration is underlined by a constant display of the elements that make up the Black American experience. There is a constant interplay between the old and the new, the earthly and the spiritual, the individual and the collective, the black and the white, the African and the European, all seen and heard through these celebrations in the music, the dancing, the attire of the combined participants. These reflect a combination of the cultural roots and sources of the culture's social and physical makeup. I'm saying that from the perspective of history and their late 1800s roots into the present, the unique New Orleans tradition of Black social club parades and funerals were much more than mere celebrations and escapist fun. They have remained a powerful and vital part of community life that have evolved into into expression of the needs of the community as affected by changes in generations, time, and the overall life in a contemporary society. Into the early 1900s, these social club functions, for example, were more like a creative combination of celebration and protest. They demonstrated a refusal to be invisible or submissive. They answered racial hostility and social limitations of the time with a massive show or display of unity, strength, and innovative musical power. By the 1940s into the 1970s, when the social and functions of the clubs were less necessary, a number of clubs declined. There were fewer of them, fewer brass bands, fewer parades, but they still remained as unique expressions of a special culture. During these mid-century decades, the social club parades still symbolized pride and strength in the face of a new, formally organized civil rights era. The music was still mainly the same traditional jazz music that it had been throughout most of the 20th century. The first brass band recordings were not made until relatively late. Now we know that jazz was first recorded in 1917. Black jazz was first recorded in 1921 and 1923. Musicians like Jelly Roll Morton, King Oliver started making bodies of the most significant records of the New Orleans style. But the brass band records didn't come along until later. Anybody have an idea when the first brass band records were made? In the 1950s. Yeah, I gave him the answer. Yeah, it's not until the 1950s that the first brass band records came along, which is maybe surprising, of course, but jazz music as a danceable commercial entity was up north, and people probably would not have understood brass band music in Chicago being played as it is in New Orleans. I remember going to as far away as the foreign country known as Baton Rouge with a brass band, and being in the community and playing a second line, and people were standing there looking at us like, what is that? Nobody danced, nobody moved, and we were looking at them going, what are they? By the late 1970s, many changes had occurred. There were more opportunities for educational advancement and employment for African Americans in and outside of New Orleans. Brass bands by these later decades had now entered into the outside commercial arena and had become highly visible parts of functions outside of the community, playing for things like jazz festivals in Europe, playing for national sports events, television commercials, James Bond movies, etc. Okay? And so they had moved out of the community into other types of functions. That commercialization had both positive and negative effects on the tradition. On the positive side, it gave brass bands and New Orleans musicians more work and visibility. but it also created a lot of changes that affected some very important parts of brass band tradition, such as the three-part trumpet harmony, which was one of the most beautiful parts. Some of the more modern bands moved down to 2 or even 1 trumpet in the commercial arena. Yet the need for vibrant community expression, rather than dying out, evolved with younger generations into an explosion of new parading clubs and a funk-based youthful brass band style that have both remained vital in community functions, but has also extended into the outside world, having both social and economic benefits. Before he holds up that card that says, "Get out," because I saw it, yeah, mine says, "Get out." No, it says, "Get out." It says 5 minutes. Yeah, you're interpreting that it's 5 minutes. No, it says, "Get out." Oh, okay, excuse me. He's asking me if I saw the movie Get Out. Okay. Yeah, I did see it. That's improvisation. That's called jazz. You know, before I conclude, I'd just like to give you a brief demonstration of some of the music of the old days. When I came along, I talked about the church parade tradition. Now, this doesn't exist anymore, but people don't necessarily associate jazz and churches. But a lot of small black, mainly Baptist churches used to have church parades on Sunday mornings when all the rowdy people were still sleeping. And those ceremonies were very dignified. Church people dressed in suits, the men in black suits, the women in white dresses, children in divisions. And they would hire a brass band. They would parade in the community from between an hour to an hour and a half. They did that for church anniversaries, pastors' anniversaries, religious holidays, founding of a new church, things like that. And I played in dozens of those my first job as a professional musician was playing in a church parade in Marrero. I'll never forget, I made $12. I thought I was rich. Went to Burger King, had a date, went to the movies, and still brought money home. But we played at the insistence of the Reverend in the church parade. The Reverend, I remember the first time I saw the Reverend said, "Now look," he told the band leader, "now look, I don't want none of that jazz, just hymns." Okay. So all we played were up-tempo hymns, but we played them in the same jazz style that we played them in the second line. So one of the first hymns we played, just to kind of give you an idea of what that sounded like, was called "Lord, Lord, Lord, You Sure Been Good to Me." Okay. We also, thank you. Also in the jazz funerals, I discovered, I didn't realize this, I thought the clarinet was a clarinet, but I eventually realized it symbolizes the weeping widow of the family. Everything is symbolic. People don't talk about those things, but so the clarinet plays usually a very high note, whiny, a lot of vibrato, really sad kind of way in jazz funerals. So I don't usually play the melody of the song, so I'll play a little of a melody and then some of what I would normally do in a jazz funeral. And then in the social club parades themselves, 1 minute left. You can do it. I can do it? Yeah. Yeah, I see that get out sign right under there. 60-second man. In the social club parades, what did we play in the second line parades? We played hymns. We played up-tempo blues songs. We played marches, jazz versions of marches, and also other special blues songs. One of the songs that was very popular is an up-tempo blues song known now as the whoopin' blues. You still hear it every now and then. And this was one of the 2 or 3 most popular songs in social club parades throughout most of the 20th century. It sounds a little bit like this. Thank you. As we look at the Tricentennial of the city and our most significant contribution, jazz, and all of the functions associated with it, it seems like the second line tradition will live on and continue to evolve on its own terms as it suits the needs of each generation, regardless to changes in the city, gentrification, or disasters like Hurricane Katrina. I'd like to close by inviting you all to the program that Dr. Senegal de Queer mentioned in the beginning. We'll be right here Sunday, March 18th at 2 p.m., a week from tomorrow, free and open to the public. And it's a program that I'm producing along with my Original Liberty Jazz Band, and we have some surprise special guests. And it's called The Sacred and the Sinful Hymns and Blues in New Orleans Jazz. Hymns and blues have always been an important part of the music, but it's very rarely talked about as to how and why. So we're going to talk about and give musical examples of hymns and blues as they were used in functions like jazz funerals and social club parades, on early jazz recordings like Sam Morgan's jazz band recordings, things like that. And it's also like a concert, so don't miss it. I've given over 24 programs, and a lot of people say, this was the best one, you got to do it again. So that's why I'm actually doing it again. I did it last year. So everybody's invited. Hope to see you there. Okay. Thank you.
All right, what a wonderful panel. And guys, I am actually so blessed because Dr. White actually shares a suite with me here at Xavier, an office suite. And every now and then, I could hear that beautiful music being played from his office. So I'm always excited when I hear it. I go to class with a little pep in my step. So I would like to invite you all to tonight's Tricentennial event. It is called Minty Nola Music at the Jazz Museum, located at 400 Esplanade. The program is going to feature amazing jazz performances by the Arrowhead Jazz Band, the Trombone Shorty Academy Band, Bon Bon Vayat, acoustical jazz with Richard Scott and Bruce Brackman, the master drummer Saguna Khan, stories with Greyhawk and Coco of the Homa Nation, and a presentation by Xavier's very own Dr. Kim Vaz DeVille and the Treme Baby Dolls. Events will begin at 6 o'clock, and they are free and open to the public. I hope to see you all there, as well as to tomorrow's event at UNO. It is the last day of the New Orleans Tricentennial Symposium, but I want you to all make it, so make sure that you leap for it or spring for it. We have daylight saving time, so I want you to all please be there, and it's going to be a wonderful final day. Thank you all for attending today's day, and I hope to see you this evening.